Thank you, Dean Weber. I was turning this because, just so you know, Rachel's going to be up over here, right? So we have to do this, so it's much easier for us to see her over here, I think, than on this side. Let me first set the tone for the format of our session here. What we're going to do is Rachel's first going to give you 10 minutes of background and her thoughts on the subject. Then we'll turn it over to Brian for another 10 minutes. Then I'm going to, as a moderator, then start to ask some questions and start the dialogue between all of us. At the same time, by the way, on your table is a card which has my cell phone number on it. If you have any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask in that context, please feel free to SMS me. I will get to those as we get to them. I'll also open the questions at a later point to both our industry partners and students. So welcome that you're all here. Let me give you just a brief background on how this idea of having today's session came about for me, and a very positive experience that I had with Airbnb. About a year and a half ago, when I was still living in Hong Kong, my girlfriend was coming back to San Francisco for a month to visit with her family. Now, she's Chinese. One of the first things that we started doing, because we knew that hotels for a month might be a little more out of our budget — I'm an academic after all — we started looking around and we checked out Airbnb. Well, she checked it out a little further, and she found a place with, interestingly enough, a woman with the exact same name as hers, Shirley Lee. So she found a place over in North Beach, and she ended up staying at her place on the couch. They became very good friends. We call her Shirley 2 now. And we ran into her on the street on Saturday because we're now living in that same area. So I had a very wonderful background experience with Airbnb, and exactly what brought me to think that this is a topic we need to be talking more about in the process of things. So without further ado, I see that we have up on our screen now from Sydney, and we really appreciate, again, as the Dean said, Rachel joining us at such an early hour in the morning on a holiday. Let's welcome Rachel.
Good morning, everyone, or should I say good afternoon. 5:30 is actually not that early for me. I have a young child, so I'm well used to it, so it's all good. 4:30 maybe, but would you like me to start now? Would you like me to give a brief introduction to everyone?
Please.
Okay, so it's wonderful to be with you all virtually. I'm praying that technology does not fail us, because I'm very passionate about technology. What I'd like to do in the next 10 minutes is to give you a very brief introduction into the wonderful world of collaborative consumption, also known as the sharing economy, and to really bring to life the number of different dimensions it actually touches on related to hospitality, whether that's food, transportation, local experiences, services, and I will leave accommodation, of course, to Brian. And what I really want to focus on in the next 10 minutes is two key themes. The first is how this actually helps grow the hospitality pie. What you often see in collaborative consumption marketplaces is that they create a market for things that never had a marketplace before, whether that's tree houses on Airbnb or TaskRabbits on Erin Networks. The second thing I really want to talk about, and I hope we get there in our Q&A, is to have a very honest conversation about how traditional players need to be more disruptive. And to be disruptive, not out of fear of marginalization, but to really embrace the opportunity we're being presented with to be very innovative around improving the travel experience, whether that's for the leisure or the business traveler. So just to begin, I'm often asked, how on earth did I start thinking about this? And it's always funny to me, because I actually started thinking about this at the start of 2008. So it's kind of like how startups say they're a 4-year success. This idea is kind of like a 5-year success that's taken a while to actually reach maturity. And one of the first things that I came across in my research that started me thinking about collaborative consumption was actually the story of eBay. Now, I often think of eBay like the godfather of this space. It's amazing to think that eBay was actually founded in 1997, when we were in the age of sort of dial-up technologies. But what's wonderful about eBay is that the story goes that it was first founded to help Pierre Amidia help his girlfriend buy and sell Pez dispensers. I should ask, can you see my slides as well? Can you see slides coming up? Oh, okay. So Liquid Space have recently done a deal with Marriott, where Marriott have basically made all their idle conference rooms, spaces in their lobby now available on the Liquid Space platform. Now, this is really smart because basically Marriott is starting to reposition itself in the world of hospitality as workspaces on demand, and it's also a new source of revenue for them. Now, the reason why I picked this example is it's a really good example of how the new entrant is often better at creating a disruptive platform, but they want to partner with traditional players. And for traditional players, it's a massive opportunity to maximize an existing asset, to maximize the utilization of an existing resource. Now, the second example is completely different. The second example is one called Dog Vacay. Now, I don't know if anyone is a dog owner in the audience, but the founder actually, it's always interesting hearing the founder's sort of stories as to why they started. His story actually went that he went away for just 10 days. He came back to a bill of $1,700 and two very frazzled dogs that had been stuck in a kennel. So he started to say, there has to be a better way. There has to be loving pet owners that are willing to give up their homes and to actually board dogs and pets. Now, this is interesting because this kind of sounds like a bit of a ridiculous idea, but when you actually look at the market size, pet services, so kennels and dog walking, is an $8 billion industry waiting for disruption. Now, the wonderful thing about Dog Vacay is it's not just simply matching people who are going away with people who are willing to walk their dog. They offer all kinds of pet services, but it's also the services, again, that they offer on the top. So when your pet goes in a home, it comes with a Dog Vacay GPS collar. So you can always track where your pup is going. Every day they take photos and they SMS them with an update on how your dog is. So again, it's a really beautiful example how a lot of people start these businesses and they think it's all about the transaction. They think it's all about the match. But that's actually the start of the service experience. That's the start of the complete experience these marketplaces have to create. Now, the last one I wanted to give you, has anyone, just shout yay because I actually can't see you. So is anyone, has anyone used TaskRabbit in the audience? Are they shouting yay?
A couple of hands.
A couple of hands.
My daughter gave me that for my birthday present this year.
Oh, she did? Wow.
Yes.
You are an early adopter. So, well, TaskRabbit is one of the hot startups in the space. And I guess the easiest way to think of TaskRabbit is like eBay for errands. So what happens is, say David needs a task doing, whether that's picking up the dry cleaning or doing the shopping, he posts it on TaskRabbit, and then vetted runners, who are called rabbits. I say vetted because this is really important. Not anyone can be a rabbit. You actually have to go through a 4-stage interview process. So there's now over 7,000 runners in the United States. They bid to run the errand, and then the poster selects who they want to do the errand based on the reputation of the rabbit and how much they're willing to pay. Now, the wonderful thing about TaskRabbit, like Airbnb, is the diversity of things that you see outsourced. So it's things that you expect, like the dry cleaning and the dog walking. I love that the most popular task posted on TaskRabbit is something we all feel the pain of doing, which is assembling IKEA furniture. It's actually posted over 200 times a day. But the other beautiful thing about TaskRabbit is people outsource errands you could never even imagine. So I'm a little bit of a geek and I play around with these marketplaces a lot. And I saw one the other day, which I thought, this is incredible. Someone with a bad back bought a new mattress. And he decided that he didn't like that it was hard because it was bad for his back. So he posted that he needed a rabbit to jump on the mattress for 2 hours to break it in. And then he specified that he'd give beer and that they could wear their shoes if they liked, but they had to like cats because the cat would like to be on the bed. Now, this story actually really loops round to where we started at the beginning, and that's that, just like the laser pointer, we can now find a match for everything from usual errands to things like needing someone to jump on our mattress. Now, the interesting thing about TaskRabbit, and this often happens in these types of marketplaces, is they diversify into places that you could never expect. So people are starting to use TaskRabbit as an on-demand concierge service when they travel. So they will use it for food delivery to their hotels. I saw one the other day where someone was actually doing San Francisco to Boston, and they had a layover in Portland, and they needed someone to run an errand to the airport because they couldn't actually get to the place they needed to go. So someone ran the errand and came to the airport. So again, it's an opportunity. When you look at these marketplaces, they may not look like they naturally tie to the hospitality industry, but when you look at the way people are using these platforms, they're often using them because it's a service that they can't find in another area of their life. Now, the interesting thing about this space is it's extremely diverse. But when you look at the marketplaces, they often have one thing in common. And the one thing in common is something that I call idling capacity. Now, idling capacity I define as the untapped social, economic, and environmental value of underused or underutilized assets. Now, that could be the rabbit on TaskRabbit who has skills and time. It could be the treehouse on Airbnb that's underutilized. It could be the person, the office space that isn't fully utilized. Now, we are living in a very unique moment in history. And we're living in a unique moment in history because for the first time, social, mobile, and location-based technologies are converging to enable us to take that idling capacity and make it liquid. So for the first time in history, we can take assets and redistribute them in ways that have never been possible before. And that's why I often say, I truly believe we're at the start of a collaborative revolution that will be as big as the Industrial Revolution. Never before have we had so many disruptive technologies converging all at once, fundamentally changing the way we live, work, and consume. Now, just as an end note, one of the things that's so important to me is how this space generates value, and generates value on lots of different dimensions. So the first one is it generates sustainable value. At the heart is actually radical efficiency of resources. We're utilizing resources, hard and soft resources, in completely new ways. The second thing is value for local economies, and I think Brian will talk about this a little bit more, but you often see that the direct impact flows right back into those local economies, right back into the pockets of people living in those communities. And the other thing you see is that people have a very different experience of a city or a place when they travel through these types of marketplaces. And then probably for me, the most important thing is value for the traveler, value for the end user. A really interesting thing about this is I've met lots of users from lots of different marketplaces, and self-interest is still usually the reason why they first engage. So by self-interest, it's usually because they can save money or they can make money. That's what intrigues them at the beginning. But the thing that keeps them sustained, the thing that keeps them coming back is completely different. And that's the social dimension. Most users talk about this space as feeding a side of them that really seeks connection and belonging. And I think there is a massive opportunity for traditional industries, including the hospitality industry, to really look at the humanness that people are searching for in these marketplaces, the human connection, and to figure out how they inject that back into their business. So as I started off by saying, I hope you throw the tough questions at me. I love the tough questions. I really want to discuss how this isn't a threat to the hospitality industry. This is actually a massive opportunity to innovate. And throughout history, great industries have sat side by side, and this is the space that we're living in right now. So really, change is the biggest opportunity here. Irrelevance is the threat. So thank you very much. It's hard to see how you're reacting because I'm in a tiny conference room in this very weird building in Sydney. But thank you for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Great applause. Great applause. By the way, I have to tell you that experience I had led me to read Rachel's books, What's Mine is Yours, and I do recommend it. So let's turn it over to the close and the near aspect of things now, and particularly related to more of the hotel hospitality type subject. And Brian, please, we welcome your remarks.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Seems like you can hear me. All right. So, I'm Brian. I'm one of the co-founders of Airbnb. Has anyone in this room ever used Airbnb before? A couple people? Oh, wow. Oh. All right. Wow. So maybe I'll talk about three things today. I'll talk about the kind of a little bit of background about Airbnb, how it got started, where we are today. I'll talk a little bit about a few stories we're seeing from the community, put a little bit more of a face to this. And I'd like to end by bringing it back to what we're talking about today and what Rachel just talked about hospitality, about collaborative consumption, the sharing economy, and maybe where I think hospitality and tourism is going in the next 5 or 10 years. I think we have some very particular views about that. So Airbnb, I never imagined myself being in the hospitality industry or in the tourism or travel industry. It was completely by accident. I was living in Los Angeles, California after I graduated from RISD. I think I, at the time, was working as an industrial designer, maybe $1,000 at the bank. And, oh, by the way, just to step back a moment, because a lot of you guys are, like, about half the audience is probably people in school. Well, I, grew up, my parents were both social workers, and I wanted to do something really interesting growing up. And my dad said, I'll support you going to art school as long as you one day get a job with health insurance. Because he somehow assumed that being an artist, I would just never have health insurance. And that was not totally unreasonable ask. So I got this job with health insurance living in Los Angeles, California. Oh. Can you still hear me? Okay, sorry. And I basically had this life, and it was a fine life, but I thought there was so much more to my life. I really thought I could maybe be an entrepreneur. Because I went to RISD, everyone told me, you're a designer. You're living in a world of other people's designs. You can change that world through design. I mean, that was a powerful message. They said you could change the world. And here I'm growing up, just told, like, oftentimes, I think a little bit more, like, kind of fit in. And I, with $1,000 at the bank, packed everything in the backseat of an old Honda Civic, and I drove up to San Francisco, California, one night. This is October 2007. I have no idea how I'm going to make rent. Joe has no idea how he's going to make rent. We're both unemployed, like people basically living in San Francisco. And an international design conference was coming to San Francisco. The hotels they were recommending on the website were sold out. And all these designers wanted to come to San Francisco. They didn't have enough money for the hotels. There was no hotel for them to stay in. So either you didn't come to San Francisco or you had to find an alternative. And that's when we had this idea. What if we turned our house into a bed and breakfast for the conference? But unfortunately, I didn't have any beds. I had 3 air beds in my closet, or Joe did. So we pulled the air beds out of the closet, and we called it the Air Bed and Breakfast. And so that's why we're called Airbnb. And so we end up hosting 3 people from around the world. And I never thought a few years later I'd be standing here or sitting here where I am today. But it was just rooted in our own problem. And building this company, when we first told people this idea, everyone thought we were out of our minds, crazy. I remember telling a mentor of mine about this idea. He said, I hope that's not the only idea you're working on. And my mom thought I was crazy. But, of course, I told my late grandfather, and he said, of course, this is how people used to travel when I was a kid. And I realized we didn't invent this idea of staying in people's homes. In fact, former Mayor Willie Brown told me during Jim Crow era, African Americans could not stay in hotels. They stay in homes. We did not invent this idea, but I think along the way, over the last few years, probably in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis, this has become a bit of a movement or a revolution. Maybe not Airbnb, but this broader idea of the sharing economy. On a typical night, like tonight, we could have as many as 100,000 people staying in homes around the world. We're in 192 countries. We're in almost every country in the world recognized by the United Nations. We're in 34,000 cities. And if you think about 100,000 people every night, I mean, that was 40 or 50,000 last summer, and that number will be significantly higher this summer, and I think it will easily be 10 to 20 times bigger, in the not too distant future. It's a huge movement that's happening all over the world. In the city of San Francisco, for example, we have people that really depend on Airbnb. 52% of people we've polled, I think it was a little over 50%, said they depend on Airbnb to pay their rent or mortgage. I thought that was a pretty staggering statistic. And we actually did an economic impact study last year and showed that we brought $54 million to the city of San Francisco. That's money that's spent on the accommodations, the homes, and money spent while you're in the city. And the average person in San Francisco in Airbnb stays here for almost a week rather than a hotel where it's about 3 days. And they're not staying in the hotel districts like here at Union Square. They're staying in local neighborhoods like the Mission and other neighborhoods where they just don't build hotels. And so you're patroning local businesses. Well, that number of 50 million, you can imagine the growth rate of like multiples every year. It's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars very soon. I think it's a really powerful idea, this idea of the sharing economy. Before I talk about the sharing economy, I'll talk about a couple stories. I'll talk about two maybe. So I was in London last year, and I met a host named Sebastian. And Sebastian comes up to me and he says, Brian, there's a word you never use on your website. And I said, what's that word? And he says, that word is friendship. I want to tell you a story about friendship. He said, 6 months ago, the London riots broke out outside my home, and I was very scared. And the next day, my mom called me to make sure I was okay. And he said, yeah, Mom, I'm okay. And she said, well, what about the house? And she said, yeah, the house is also okay. And he said, Brian, here's the remarkable thing. Between the time that my mom called me and the time the riots broke out was a 24-hour window of time. And in that window of time, 7 of my previous Airbnb guests called me to make sure I was okay. He says, think about that. 7 of my guests called me before my own mother did. I don't know if sure what that says maybe about him and his mother, but him and our previous guest. But that's an incredibly personal relationship. I'll tell you one other story kind of like this. I was in Berlin. We meet up a guest named George. George grew up in Berlin, and he was a guard along the Berlin Wall. And he grew up in West Germany. So he's a guard on the west side of Germany. And he now lives in Scandinavia. And he was visiting Berlin again, where he's from. And he stayed with a host, and this host name was Kai. And so George is probably in his 50s. He was a guard in the 1980s along the Berlin Wall. He's talking to Kai, his host, in his home, and Kai says, that's interesting, because I was also a guard along the Berlin Wall in the 1980s. But I was a guard on the east side of Germany. And they're talking to each other, and they realize they're actually guards like in the same years, at the same time. And he said, well, where were you a guard? And it turns out they were a guard at the same checkpoint. And then as George is staring in Kai's face, he has like this sudden flashback of the same face, but about 20 years younger with a helmet on, a gun staring him in the face. And suddenly this other was his host, and they were hosting each other. And tonight we'll have 100,000 relationships like that coming from 192 countries. It's like a United Nations at every kitchen table. It's an incredibly, incredibly powerful idea. Never in human history has this been possible. And I think there's something about this idea. And so maybe I'll bring it out to the sharing economy. I think we're living in the midst of a revolution, and I actually don't think very many people are talking about it. You know, the travel industry is a pretty big industry. Depending on who you ask, many people say it's about a $2 trillion industry. That's a pretty big industry. So Google, Facebook, Twitter, all these companies compete for advertising. That's a $500 billion industry. So think about it. Travel is already, tourism, hospitality, depends on how you want to define it, already 4 times larger than the market these huge tech companies are competing for. Today, we have about 1 billion international trips in the world, but in 1960, there were only about 25 million. That number, 1 billion, will double to 2 billion in the next, within the next decade. The travel industry could very likely overtake the oil industry to be the largest industry in the world. I mean, how many people are talking about that? Not many. Maybe you guys are. But outside of like hospitality schools, I don't think it's being said very much. I actually think, broadly speaking, travel, tourism, and hospitality will be the dominant form of entertainment in the future. Why? Because Airbnb, we're not competing with hotels, we're competing with Facebook. What does that mean? If you weren't going to stay on Airbnb, you probably would have stayed home on Facebook. Airbnb, in the sharing economy, and travel is a physical manifestation of the internet. The internet allowed you to virtually go everywhere around the world. Well, what happens when you actually can go everywhere around the world? That is what we do. We are the physical manifestation of the social network. We're the social network in the real world in many ways. And that, I don't mean to say we're actually competing with Facebook, but it's absurd to think that this is a zero-sum game. For us to win, no one has to lose. and especially not in a market that's growing unbelievably quickly. And so I think this is an unbelievably exciting time. And it's not just Airbnb. As Rachel says, this is, I think, as she says, as profound as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution basically meant that we lived in a world created by machines, systems, and institutions. That's the things we trusted. We trusted factories, we trusted brands, we trusted governments and corporations. And I think the sharing economy really means an economy powered by people. What we're really saying is that we can now trust people again, because those people have reputations. And I think we all want to live in a world that's not mass-produced. I think we're going to live in a world post-mass production. And you actually think about yourself, what will be mass-produced 20, 30 years from now? It's actually hard to imagine a ton of things being mass-produced. Almost everything, we think, is going to be personalized to some extent. We all aren't the same. We're not archetypes. We don't want the same experiences. I think this goes not only for the sharing economy, but for hotels as well. They're going to want a personalized experience for every single person. So I think we're in the midst of a really huge revolution. And I think it's not just offered by companies like Airbnb. As Rachel says, there's so many different categories. Dog vacay could be really huge. Who would have thought? And the country of Spain, unemployment under 30 is like over 50%. But yet one of the biggest exports is tourism. And that's going to be what people want when they go to Spain. They're going to want to have unique experiences. Well, these young Spaniards could be local entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs that could give tours, that could be hosts, and they have special skills. They can have a place in this new economy. And people's place in this new economy could be as entrepreneurs, like I am. I was not taught to be an entrepreneur. I went to art school. But I did it, and anyone can do it at this point. And I hope Airbnb one day creates 1 million entrepreneurs, or millions of entrepreneurs, micro-entrepreneurs. And this sharing economy ecosystem, I think, can create trillions of dollars of value for the world. Because, again, it's an economy powered by people. So maybe I'll end there and just say that, I think it's incredibly exciting, and I think what we're in is the midst of a huge revolution. The Economist did a story about it, and some other people, and Rachel's talked quite extensively about it, but this is not an internet phenomenon. This is not a niche phenomenon. This could be something that has enormous historical precedence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. That was great. I love the passion of both of you about it, because I feel the same, much the same way. Having been overseas and used that myself, and in particular, and you refer to things like Spain, and Rachel, you talked about it and other aspects of it. One question I'd like to kind of start us with is, as it relates to the hospitality industry, which is hotels, restaurants, meetings and event services, and so on. It's a global phenomenon, but is it different in different cultures, or is it the same? Can it operate in the same way? Is it the same sites? Rachel, maybe from your perspective down in Sydney, you might want to take that first.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, aside from the cultural differences, how common the marketplaces are. So what you see is, like, some companies, like Airbnb, they have a very global footprint, but then in countries where there is a real cultural nuance, and it's often a cultural nuance around how people form trust, that you can really only understand from that culture, you often see another entrant into the marketplace. So a really good example is in South Korea. Kazaza is kind of like the Korean Airbnb. And it's dealing with the nuances of how people really sort of trust one another in these marketplaces. Similarly, you see marketplaces that have very sort of unique regulations that are specific to that country, often operated by that country. So peer-to-peer lending, where people are lending money to one another, isn't so much a global player. But the thing that always surprises me is that when you actually talk to the users, their motivations, their reasons to engage in these marketplaces is almost exactly the same, regardless of geography and also regardless of age. And I think that's a really important thing to point out, because the number of times that I'm asked or told that this is all a millennial thing. I mean, Brian will be able to give more statistics in terms of the breakdown within the Airbnb marketplace, but this isn't the case. Like, the spread across ages is really interesting. You actually find that the 55 plus demographic is a really engaged demographic in this space.
Just a quick aside before Brian catches it. I was at a meeting recently where I was on a panel, and I thought I was a baby boomer, but somebody told me I was a late baby boomer. So yeah, and I've used it. So the generations, I guess, I didn't know there was a difference in late and early baby boomers, but I'm a late one. Brian, your thoughts on what you've seen on the international level and how it operates?
Yeah, so I've been incredibly surprised, and not by how different everyone is, but how similar they are. And so let me give you some examples. We launched in the summer of 2008 for the Democratic National Convention. We provide housing for the DNC for the inauguration. Until a year and a half ago, we had no offices or any footprint internationally around the world. And even then, we were a primarily international company. Today, only a third of our business is in the United States. So it's shocking to me when I go city by city how similar people are. I think it's really powerful. So every local market has its own culture, but we're starting to live in this world where people are dual citizens. They're citizens of where they're from, and they're also global citizens. And that is a real phenomenon. What happens when you live in a world of global citizens? And the more we're connected digitally and the more we travel, the more we actually become global citizens. And you meet the same type of people in every city. Maybe the one difference I've seen isn't that the cities are different, but they're in a different kind of time scale. They're either, like, let's call San Francisco present day. Some cities are either somewhat behind in the past of San Francisco or in front of San Francisco with regards to this kind of new movement in travel. Actually, a city that I think is the most forward-thinking and in the future is where Rachel is right now, probably in Sydney. I went to Sydney last October, and it's like being in the United States in 2014 or 2015. I'm from a collaborative and travel perspective, and probably because the 20 or so million people there are amongst the most well-traveled people in the world. They're therefore incredibly open-minded. Maybe a market that's a little further behind us is Tokyo. I just came back from Tokyo last week, and it's just a newer concept over there. So, you know, and just I'll speak for a moment to demographics. You say you're a baby boomer. You know, demographics is something that was kind of, when I think of demographics, I think of 1950s marketing, because I think we used to be able to segment people by demographics, and I don't think you can actually segment people that well by demographics anymore. I prefer to use psychographics. I prefer to say you're an artist or you're this kind of person rather than in age. I mean, 5% of our users are over the age of 70. And our average age is, I don't know the exact age, but it's in the middle late 30s. It's not a young backpacking kind of digitally savvy whatever people. These are the archetypes that we get. Hipsters in Williamsburg. We have plenty of those, but it's not just them. It's a wide range of people all over the world. So,
great. One question. I have a couple of questions. First for Rachel, and then for Brian. Rachel, one question for you from the audience. Says one of our sponsors here, John Handerley, would like to know from you is has Australia calmed down yet since Adam Scott's victory in the Masters?
You know, I'm not actually Australian. I'm not a fraud.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Just to admit, so I hope you can hear, I actually am British, and then I spent 10 years in the States, and then I married an Australian, and people often say, you know, what's the biggest culture shock? And it's really two things. First of all, is the tyranny of distance. You know, when you get on a plane to Australia, Brian, you talk about being well-traveled, that's because no flight is ever under 12 hours. You know, we think 12 hours is a short hop. So Australia has a very unique relationship to travel. And then the second, as you said, they are obsessed with sport. You know, you can have the national election running, and then you can have a cricket match. No one's watching the national election in Australia. It's really quite crazy. So no, we have not calmed down after winning the Masters. It was still going on about the Ashes. That was 10 years ago.
Hey, all right. Brian, more specific question for you. What do you view as your biggest challenge? Basically, they say, pardon the lame question, but what keeps you up at night?
So what keeps me up at night isn't the answers probably people expect, because I think people expect external things happening to Airbnb or things getting in the way of Airbnb growing. I had an old mentor, or not an old mentor, only a few years ago, but seems so long ago. Paul Graham, our very first investor, he created Y Combinator, and he used to tell me, he says, Don't worry about things outside of you. He says, startups die of suicide, not homicide. So, and actually that's true of all companies. No company ever gets killed by another company, even a company that seems to get killed. You almost entirely always die of self-inflicted wounds. You didn't innovate, you screwed up the culture, you did something wrong, and people found a better way. So the things that keep me up at night, if there's something that would keep me up at night, is things internally. It's not existential or external things. You know, just to give you a quick summary of how we run the company, there's 3 pillars of how I think you run a company. There's 3 words: love, foundation, growth. Actually, it starts with foundation. You want to build a foundation for a long-term company. Foundation, what you stand for, your culture, is a thing that exists for 100 years. Think about Disney. They're not making the same products they made 50 years ago, but they have probably a very similar culture. That culture will permeate for generations after I'm gone. That culture is the thing, and the passionate employees that create a product that our customers love. And if you have people creating a product that customers love, then it's going to grow. And so I'm actually not worried about growth, and I'm not really worried about things getting in the way of growth externally, because I think that growth comes internally. It comes from making a product people love, and it's always going to change. And that really comes from having a culture that's innovative, where people love coming to work every single day. You know, the advice I get from my investors actually is don't screw up the culture. And I think that's something that is probably not what you'd expect the answer to be.
Very interesting. Let me go back to one of the questions that I had in my mind, and maybe for others out here too, is that as we think about this in relationship to renting out that extra apartment room or bringing a private chef in for cooking and those kind of things, that as a difference from the traditional hospitality business. I go back to, as I mentioned at lunch, on the California Hotel and Lodging Association board meeting that I was at recently, where I mentioned Brian was going to speaker, and one person asked, what's Airbnb, one of the hotel owners, and the other said he's putting his hotels on Airbnb. So I guess my question is, in the collaborative consumption aspect for traditional hotels and restaurants, is there a space that they should be considering? Is there something they should be doing? Rachel, we can start with you on your side.
Well, I think just to take a macro view of that question, the other interesting thing is how the marketplaces react when you take, let's call it traditional inventory, and you sort of mix it within sort of the peer-to-peer marketplace. And that's actually a very delicate balance you have to maintain, because, you know, as Brian's talked about, like what people are often looking for is that unique experience. They're looking for that unique place to stay and that unique host. So it's how you actually take traditional inventory of assets and mix it into these peer-to-peer marketplaces that is actually quite a complicated thing. That's why I actually use the example of Liquid Space, because they're doing it extremely well. For the end user, the experience is pretty seamless, but also the end experience becomes the same. If I was in the hospitality industry right now, I would start looking at sort of the whole ecosystem of services. So imagine you're a hotel and you actually partner with someone like Relay Rides or Get Around, and you can actually say to your hotel guests, don't go and drive some Mini. Like, we can actually offer you a Porsche, we can offer you a Ferrari, we can offer you a cool car for much less through a company like Relay Rides. Can you imagine if you're in a hotel and they actually said, we have this concierge service with TaskRabbit where you can get anything done any hour of the day? If you look at some of the really interesting food experiences that are going on, like Feastly and Grub with Us, can you imagine if you actually check into concierge and they say, don't go to a traditional hotel, why don't you go and have this traditional meal in this house or this underground cheese factory? So there's so much you can actually offer guests within the traditional infrastructure of a hotel, and that is the low-hanging fruit. I mean, you don't even have to partner really with any of these startups to actually become knowledgeable in how you offer these services. The second thing is how you actually think about a hotel. So you think about all the assets a hotel has, and you actually do an assessment. You say, which of these assets aren't being fully utilized, and how could we actually use these marketplaces to maximize the utilization of those assets?
Brian, I mean, are you expanding it or competing with it? What is your perspective?
So, well, I think that we're an open platform, so I think within guardrails, anyone can list on Airbnb. We have a couple rules. First is it's got to be unique, one of a kind. It can't be something mass-produced. Second is it's got to be personal. It's got to really be a person connected to something, not just a corporation. And it doesn't mean there can't be a corporation, it has to be a person. But actually that brings me to this next point, which is I think that we won't necessarily live in two worlds in the future. I mean, do we really think we're going to live in two different worlds? One's a peer world, and then one's like a mass-produced world, and we're going to kind of go between the two? I don't think that's actually going to happen. I actually think the two worlds are going to converge. As the sharing economy becomes a one-day, presumably multi-trillion-dollar industry, it's going to become more professionalized. And I also think that the traditional kind of mass-produced world, which has pretty much existed since World War II, where we wanted everything to be the same, I think is going to become much more local and much more personal. And I think it's going to change dramatically the hotel industry, the restaurant industry. It will. It has to. Let me give you some examples. When I stay in a hotel, almost every room is designed exactly the same. Why is that? Not every person's exactly the same. And if you love, I love, I don't know, Bob Dylan, why am I having Celine Dion playing in the room or whatever? That's an example. Why is the minibar, if I'm am I a recovering alcoholic, why is there alcohol in the minibar? That just seems like a sick joke. So just the idea is that hotels themselves in the future, I believe, are going to be much more local and personal. Everyone in Airbnb can book, and you can connect to your Facebook account. We can know many of your likes, many of your preferences. A hotel can know all of the exact same things, and then they can personalize the experience to you. With payments methods like Square, suddenly, here's the big metaphor. People who used to buy things, anything, were strangers. You were a stranger. And so because you were a stranger, you had to have something that was the lowest common denominator, had to be the same and consistent as everyone else. We're no longer strangers. Consumers, guests aren't strangers. They all have profiles. You can know everything about this person. And when that happens, they're going to demand more personalized experiences. And we're going to move away from a world that is mass-produced. And it doesn't mean that this pure world has to kill or overtake this other world. It means that the world of hospitality is going to adapt to become more local and personal. I think great hotels like this one and many upscale hotels are personalized. They have loyalty programs. But the entire industry is going to become more personalized.
Can I just add to that?
Please, go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think Brian raises a really important point because this isn't an obvious opportunity, but it's a huge opportunity, which is in so many areas of our lives, we're leaving this digital exhaust of our preferences, how we behave, where we work, what we like to eat. And I see very few traditional companies really saying, how can we create, sort of harness this digital exhaust that we're creating through our devices on a daily basis and actually use that to really understand who's entering our hotel. So you're seeing a lot of companies talk about big data, but it's often big data generated within their own ecosystem. And a much more interesting opportunity is actually to say, how can we holistically look at data, not just generated through the sharing economy, but all health devices, and actually really get to know who's coming to stay. So how you actually take the digital exhaust that these marketplaces generate in steroids and use that to enhance your own experience is another massive opportunity that I haven't heard anyone talking about.
Absolutely. So I said, I'm getting lots of questions from you, but do we have any students out there who have any questions they'd like to ask in a live environment? Right back there. Kathleen.
So my general question is, when it comes to the discussion of startups and technology, I think one of the big questions is whether or not what we're seeing is timeless and that it's being trendy, or if it's timeless. And so how do you kind of make that decision whether or not a company like a huge hotel chain should jump onto that train because it's timeless, or it's something that's timely and it's going to pass as a trend and they don't have that time to implement it into all of their brand?
So, it's a really good point. And, one of the things I wanted to make clear was there are a lot of trends in Silicon Valley, and some come and some go. And the notion of the sharing economy, and let me just maybe kind of say it another way, the notion of things in the world being local and personal, because that's kind of what it is, about a world after mass production, an economy powered by people that have reputations, where things aren't the same and they're of the local culture, and this is not a trend, this is timeless, and maybe the evidence of that is before World War II, this is how the world was. In fact, for the most of the time, the world was actually a village, as Rachel says. It was only after World War II that we lived in this kind of very specific kind of world with the TV industrial complex. So I think we are bringing ourselves back to the way we always were. That's the first thing. I also think, by the way, just within tourism, we're hardwired as people to travel. We're nomadic people, like civilizations like 50,000 years old, and like we were nomadic. There were nomads for 45,000 of those years. We're wired to actually be people that travel. We're wired to be nomads. And it doesn't mean we're going to be completely nomadic, but I think the idea of mobile, that you can have a computer in your pocket, it means that we're going to be moving all over the world much more. So I think that, like, who knows what the world will look like in 100 years, but like 10, 20, 30 years, if we start to look at these kinds of horizons, it seems like a trend or a movement that can't be reversed. People will have more power. We're going to have more entrepreneurs as soon as we have a reputation. It's like a genie that's out of the bottle. You can never put this back in the bottle. And there's so much value that's unlocked that we'll never move away from all this value.
I would, I'd add to that forget the name of the place. If you actually look at the big shift in behaviors that it represents, it's far more than a trend. So just to give a couple to you, I was talking to the car companies and they asked the same question, will this go away, kind of optimistically. And it's interesting, actually, 5 of the big car manufacturers have all said, our future's in mobility services, it's not in selling cars. Now, what they're looking at is, for example, there was this really interesting study done in Germany where they interviewed 18 to 24-year-olds, and they said, you have a choice. You can either own a smartphone or you can own a car. And 75% chose the smartphone. Now, this is a brilliant example of how we now see the phone as access to the physical world. We don't need to own lots of physical goods. We can now access them on demand. But more importantly, the status symbols in life are changing. So, owning a house, owning a car, staying in a fancy hotel, these were often the status symbols. This was how we used to say who we are and where we stood in society. That's fundamentally changing. I think it's wonderful when you speak to people on Airbnb who are superhosts, where they talk about their reputation status as something, a social standing in society. So it's fundamentally changing in terms of the way we think about accessing things. But also, there's a massive value shift underway. There's no way we're going back, because the future actually looks much brighter in terms of values, and it's actually taking us back to old values that are innate to us.
Yeah, Rachel actually brought up a really good point. Like, in the future, the stuff that matters will not be stuff. It's going to be experiences, and those are kind of like the new objects of desire. They're unique experiences that you want to have and you want to share with other people. And I think that suits itself very well to the hospitality industry.
Well, and I think one of the comments that you both made, and Rachel did early on, was that this was all about the building relationships and a trust factor. And I think if I can summarize some of the questions that I've been getting on the other side of things, if you will, is, I tend to personally be a trusting person. That's why, for me, Airbnb was an easy fit. But not everybody feels the same way in the process. And, what happens when trust doesn't turn out to be what we expected it to be in this, and something happens one way or another? How does that enter into the picture, and how do we prevent that?
Yes.
or enhance it, if you will?
So there's kind of the short-term and long-term outlook here. Short-term, present day, I think we're finally able to provide the kind of technology where we can do the kind of screening that even government agencies can't actually do, or that traditional businesses can't do. So on Airbnb, you can verify a variety of your information, your LinkedIn, your Facebook account. We have a trust and safety team that can verify other identification information about people that you don't even do, you don't do for many things. We can get beyond government level screening with the modern technology that we have now. And that's the beginning part. The next thing you can do is build a reputation. And that reputation builds online. This is like a currency. So in any technology, there's essentially the early adopters that are adventurous because they're willing to try something when there's still some kinks in the system. And the equivalent of the sharing economy are unreviewed people. But in the future, once everyone's using it for a period of time, the history of their behavior is going to be built, and there's going to be a huge currency of reviews. And as we get to economies of scale, we can start to offer things like insurance and other types of things. We didn't offer that when we first launched, and now we have a guarantee, $1 million for every home on our website, and I think over a dozen countries. And these kinds of things are just the beginning. So as the market gets more mature, we build more reputation. We're able to do screening that even the government couldn't be able to do with the modern technology we have today. And we allow economies of scale where we can offer other types of protections. And if somebody's not super adventurous, that's fine. You can stay with a super host. You can stay with somebody who's got 50 reviews. You can stay with an actual bed and breakfast. We have tens of thousands of people who self-select themselves as actual bed and breakfast. And if you're a little more adventurous, we have that for you too. So.
Rachel, when you're looking at a broader perspective, are there some examples out there? I mean, I think of things like Zipcar today, where that trust factor is already just an accepted aspect in the collaborative consumption sharing economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Trust is a word that's thrown a lot around to the space, and you really have to break it down into there's 3 dimensions of trust that we actually have to think about. First is actually trust in the idea. Now, the biggest threat to this space is actually inertia. It's ignorance. So it's how do you actually get people to trust often what seems like a new behavior. The second level of trust is actually trust in the company or the brand. So I don't think the era of companies or brands is over. You know, Airbnb is still a company, and it's very important for the companies to actually figure out up front what role do they want to play? How involved in the community do they get when issues actually arise? Because you can say we're a completely open marketplace, so it's up to the community to resolve things, or you can actually say we're going to put assurances in place, so if something goes wrong, you can actually come to us. And then the third level is actually the peer-to-peer trust. So it's the trust that the community actually generates. And I think the thing that has amazed me when you look at across the marketplaces is how few things actually go wrong. I mean, the media loves it when something goes wrong, but there are even if you look at social lending, the default rate is 0.49%. With traditional banks, it's 3 to 4%. Now, that's another really powerful indicator, because what happens is if you create marketplaces where you're saying to people, trust one another, there's a degree of accountability, there's a degree of transparency that doesn't exist when they're having anonymous transactions. So I actually think this whole way that we can now merge the physical world with the virtual world, so we can merge real identities with virtual identities, we haven't even seen the effect that's going to have on all kinds of industries. It will completely transform the way we interact with all different services, because the role of many companies to facilitate trust will go away.
Thank you. We could sit here all afternoon if we all had time and probably ask many more questions, but I'm afraid that we are out of time. And Rachel, I know you want to go and start enjoying your holiday there. So I'd like to ask you if you have any just closing comments, and then I'll ask Brian the same before we sign off.
No, I mean, first of all, I think and I'm not just saying this, I think it's fantastic that you're hosting this type of forum, because it's something that I'm trying to do more of. Like, we have to stop actually talking about these 2 worlds as separate things, the industrial world, the collaborative world, the traditional world, the startup world. Really, for me, it's where these 2 worlds, if you like, I'm now doing it, but where the intersection happens, that's where we can actually really create some powerful experiences and new types of companies. So, the whole idea that this is a massive threat and the people within this space want to kill traditional jobs, or we don't care about the end consumer and it's extremely dangerous, like, that's almost a distraction to the innovation and the opportunity that exists, not just from sort of an industry perspective, but really actually to improve the world.
Absolutely. Thank you. Brian.
So maybe my closing thoughts would be to what I think are the 2 audiences in this room. The first would be to probably all the students that are going to be graduating. And, I didn't graduate that many years ago, and I can only imagine, I graduated from art school, had a lot of anxiety. I had so much pressure about getting a job, and I remember what that felt like. And I actually think this is an unbelievably exciting time. And I actually think this is a time where we can create more entrepreneurs than we ever had in the past. before kind of, especially this mobile era, I don't think a lot of people came out of school saying, I'm going to start my own hotel or my own kind of large multinational business. And now you can, like, literally 30 days. I mean, our business, we built the original website in 3 days. It was 3 days.
Wow.
So, you could, honestly, you could probably, in like a week or two, if you wanted to leave this room today, you could have a business in a week or two. That's literally how long it could take if you get the right
3 days,
people.
you can get on the cover of Forbes. Not bad.
Exactly.
Not bad.
So I think it's an unbelievably exciting time, and I think, I wouldn't limit your own. I think the biggest mistake anyone can make is limiting their thinking of what is available to the world, and don't imagine the jobs that exist today. Imagine the jobs that will exist a few years from now, and maybe you'll be the one to create those jobs. And I think to all the people already in the industry, just thinking about, like, how can we all be a little bit more personal? How can we all be a little more local in our experience every single day? Because we've done something for the last 20, 30 years doesn't mean we can't do something profoundly different. And you have the ability to have such a more personalized experience for every single guest that comes into your restaurant, to your event, or to your hotel. And I think the opportunities are unbelievable right now. This is like a golden age that we're going to be entering. So,
I'm excited for it. Well, this today was an opportunity for us to talk about one of those 3 pillars that we have, and that is the eco and ethos, and the aspect of being local is a big part of that. So this is a beginning of the conversation, through our own LinkedIn group and discussion, through others. I know, Rachel, you have one as well. I think this is something that has to continue from here. So I want to thank Rachel from Sydney and Brian here for being here with us today and talking about this great topic and getting the conversation started. Thank you. Rachel, we have a little gift for you, but we can't give it to you maybe virtually. But Brian, we have a little, ladies, if you'd like to come up here to thank you very much.
Nisha Knox, I'm the program manager for this year, and this is Olivia, and we just wanted to present a gift to you. This is a Recology plate. It's personalized to you, and it's sustainable. And we also have one for Dr. Jill. So thank you so much, and as well, thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Now you're all sitting there waiting, what happens next, right? Okay. Well, I think we've had a great day of discussion today, and I really appreciate all the support of all of you students and industry speakers today, and I thank you all for a great 23rd Annual Hospitality Industry Symposium. Thank you. But the reality of this event isn't really everything we've been saying in the dialogue we've been starting. The reality of this event is this is a class. Okay? This was a class that started at the beginning of the semester with 5 students who took this from every aspect and did this event. And we would be remiss if we didn't point the fact out that they are the ones that made all of this happen today. And I want to bring them up here and introduce them individually. First, Anisha Knox, who's our program manager. Step right up on the stage, Anisha. Second, Livia Yee, who is the marketing, communications, and sponsorship manager. Please step right up here, ladies. Marizan Reyes, who is the registration manager. Sophia Chow, the events logistic manager. And P.E. Bonner Lee, who's coming up now, who was the human resource manager. These 5 ladies made it happen. So we'd like to give them a token in KO, if you would.
Thank you, Dr. Jill.
Let her get the gifts out first.
I gotta hold on a little while. All right.
stage is
Well,
yours.
thank you all for such a wonderful event, for participating, and we had a really great time planning it. We definitely had all of our highs and lows, our struggles, but I think everything turned out in the end, so thank you guys as well. We just wanted to recognize a few people who made this event possible. First, Kale, could you please come to the stage? The privilege of working with her for a couple years as well, and we wouldn't have been able to pull off this event without her guidance. Secondly, we'd like to call Emily Doyle to the stage. Yeah, Emily Doyle +1. She's been the biggest help here, our program assistant, always there for us whenever we needed her, and we really appreciate it. We'd also like to thank Professor Millar and the Business 284 class for all of your guys' wonderful help, all of our volunteers, Professor Millar. All of the students that you saw greeting you guys today, running mics, running all types of errands. They were here at 7 o'clock in the morning, and we really appreciate all you guys and your hard work as well. Kind of worked out weird, but we're presenting him with his plate already. But thank you, Dr. Jones, for all of your guidance, for being the leader. He always would say that he's the COO, and we're working with him. So we thank him as well for all of his guidance in this event.
Once again, thank you all, and I will remind you again, for those of you who weren't here this morning, that we have the University of San Francisco, USF, Department of Hospitality Management, LinkedIn group that's about discussing these issues and continuing this discussion today. We're using the hashtag of 3 Pillars of Excellence to keep this conversation going. So thank you all for being here today. I know that this will continue to be our discussion for the next year, and we'll hear more next year. But again, thank you to this team right here for putting it all together. Enjoy it. Have a great day. Can we get the mic up for just a second? One other thing going out, to keep up with our sustainability aspect, please turn your name badges back in so they can be recycled. Please turn your name badges back in. That was one of the tweets I got or one of the SMSs I got, and I forgot it. Thank you again.